I think, sadly enough, it is clear for us in Israel that for Netanyahu, this has become a war for him to try to stay in power. And he is going to drag it as long as he can. The national security advisor of Netanyahu, Tzachi Hanegbi, a few weeks ago said that this war has 7 more months to go. He didn't say 7 months because he actually sat on the maps and calculated how long it will take to move the troops from one place to another. He said 7 months because it's a political calendar. It's the US elections in November. So it's very, very clear that this is what Netanyahu is waiting. And for the even more extreme elements in the government, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, for them, having this extremist government in Israel is like winning the Israeli lottery. It's obvious that what they want to do is to wait this out with the hope that Trump wins and gets into the White House, and then they would win also the American lottery. Yeah? And then they can go even further, more wild in the West Bank. Yeah, we've seen already, since this government took office, we have a record of advancement of housing units and settlements, of retroactively approving outposts, of declaring state land, which is a euphemism for grabbing Palestinian land, of displacement of Palestinian communities, 60 entire communities, over 1,000 Palestinians being forcibly transferred, of settler violence. Yeah, this has already been a record year. At the end of May, May 29th, the Israeli Central Command General, who is basically the sovereign power over the West Bank, signed a special order transferring powers over most of civilian life in the West Bank from the military to the settlement administration within the Ministry of Defense under Smotrich. Basically an act of the annexation of the West Bank. Now, if all these record numbers have already happened before Smotrich had all the authorities, now he has majority of authorities over civilian affairs in the West Bank, this is just going to accelerate. Imagine that reality with Trump in the White House. It's even way worse. So for Bezalel Smotrich, he's like a child in a candy store that is promised a candy factory around the corner. Yeah, that's what we are looking for. So for the sake of the hostages, for the sake of Palestinians in Gaza, for the sake of the day after, yeah, because the disproportionate use of force in the Gaza Strip is just sowing seeds of hatred for generations to come, and for the sake of stopping the acceleration of annexation, we need our friends in the US and in Europe to step in and make sure that we have a ceasefire as soon as possible. I would argue that still a significant amount of Israeli society does not see the use of force of the IDF in Gaza as disproportionate. So the opinion that I hold, that we've crossed the opinion that I hold that we crossed numerous moral red lines, and what we are doing in Gaza is morally unacceptable, is still a minority position within Israeli society. It's not a completely fringe position, but it is a minority position. I hope I make sense by that. But I do think that today there is a growing frustration from the lack of fulfillment of the goals of the war after so many months, after all this use of force. But then I would say that society is polarized in how do you respond to this and who do you blame? So you basically have the center-left that are blaming Netanyahu. And basically the narrative in the center-left is you refused to talk about diplomacy, you refused to talk about the day after, you refused to present an alternative to Hamas ruling Gaza. Hence, despite the horrendous attacks of October 7 by Hamas against us, and the very significant level of international solidarity right after that, we have lost international backing, and we haven't achieved the goals that were set. While the Israeli political right and extreme right are actually blaming the military for not using enough force, for not being aggressive enough. Hence, we haven't really achieved the goals that we set to ourselves via the military operation. And what we need to do is be more ruthless, be more aggressive, not give humanitarian aid, starve people, etc., etc. Yeah? So I think that's kind of like where we are. The frustration of not achieving the goals of the war are shared by a majority of the population in that sense. It's just that it's very polarized politically. Who do you blame for the lack of fulfillment of the goals? I think one of the most worrying things is that, we as a military and as a society, we've traveled so far without even paying attention to it. And the unthinkable has become thinkable, and the immoral has become acceptable. Over 20 years ago, the IDF carried a targeted assassination of Saleh Shadeh, who was the leader of the Hamas military wing at the time. If I remember right, about 14 innocent women and children, 3 of his wives and 11 children of his, were killed in that attack, one-ton bomb in the building. And there was outrage in Israel. There was a petition to the Supreme Court. There were protests. And ultimately there was an investigation committee that basically argued that there was a mistake in intelligence and in the assessment of the collateral damage of that strike. And if they would have known that 14 women and children will be killed in that strike, they wouldn't carry it out. And that's for the head of the military wing of Hamas. And this operation, in this war, we have reports on strikes against medium-level commanders of Hamas where collateral damage of 3 digits, of over 100 innocent civilians, are approved in advance. And that's not for the head of military wing of Hamas. Yeah, so you kind of try to see where we were 20 years ago and where we are now. Yeah, how the level of moral deterioration that we went through as a society and an army is just mind-blowing. Yeah, and it's shameful. And to be in a place where today so many in our society think that this is actually not bad enough, that this is not aggressive enough, that this is actually restraint and constraint, it's beyond imagination. But that's the reality we live in. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not just the horrors of October 7. It's also an accumulation of a process of dehumanization of Palestinians, of moral corruption, of 57 years of occupation that is accelerated by the horrendous massacres carried by Hamas on October 7. But, this moral deterioration, this track, is something that we've been traveling for a while. The Israeli occupation is an historical event that happened in 1967. There was a war and Israel occupied the territories. No. That's a complete misunderstanding of what the Israeli occupation is. The Israeli occupation is an offensive campaign, is an ongoing offensive campaign against Palestinian independence that started in June 67 and has never stopped for a second since then. Any moment that goes by, the territories are being reoccupied. And I don't only mean in the sense that every house you build in a settlement, you physically reoccupy. In every Palestinian plot of land, you declare state land and grab it from them, you reoccupy the territories, obviously. I'm also talking about every random checkpoint an IDF patrol puts on the streets of the West Bank to do what we call in the military to disrupt the day-to-day routine of people in the area. Basically, arbitrary restrictions to mess up with people's lives. We reoccupy the territories. And every random Palestinian house we invade at night with a patrol, to do what we call in the IDF to make our presence felt. So the idea is that every Palestinian will get the feeling that we are right here. We're breathing down your neck. You never know when we're gonna come into your house, what we're gonna do, when it's gonna start, when it's gonna end. It's to do what we call in the military to create a sense or the feeling of being chased, of being pursued inside the Palestinian population. You reoccupy the territories. This is all an offensive campaign to prevent the Palestinian state. This is why, by the way, historically, in the wars of Gaza, my understanding was that, for example, in the war in 2014, Protective Edge, or Cast Lead 2008-9, my understanding was very simple. Those wars were just part of how we control Gaza. So if in the West Bank, the way we control the West Bank is by fragmentation of the territory of settlements, by separation via checkpoints in a permit regime, with patrols that bump into random houses in the middle of the night, with random checkpoints that disrupt. In Gaza, we have the siege, and every few years, we have a massive operation. So, in my understanding, those wars, those operations, were part of how we maintained the occupation in Gaza. October 7, in my opinion, changes a little bit this war. So if the war in 2014 is part of how we control and how we occupy Gaza, then the bottom line, Israel is not defending itself in that war. Israel is defending occupation in that war. But October 7, I think, changes this war. Because of this horrendous massacre that Hamas has carried out. This war, I would argue, started fully justified. The problem is, yes, Israel has not only a right, but an obligation to defend itself, but it needs to be within the boundaries of international law. And what we know is that Israel is violating front and center international law. So, this is a war that was justified, but it's being carried out in a completely unjustified manner. And that's another reason why this war has to end yesterday, months ago. So it's not only the fact that the hostages are coming only in a deal, it's also the fact that we are carrying this war in an immoral way.